The plasma bombardment began at 03 for 7 hours, and Kestra Vaughn knew immediately that humanity's last gamble had failed. She pressed her face against the reinforced transparent stele of the command bunker, watching New Geneva's skyline dissolve under torrents of superheated death. Each hegemony warship hung in Earth's atmosphere like a cancerous star, their weapons carving molten scars across the city's desperate architecture. The orbital defense platform's humanity's final, pathetic gesture had lasted exactly 14 minutes against the Velter fleet. "Ma'am, the western districts are gone," reported Lieutenant Borignex, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Casualty estimates are, we've lost 2 million civilians in the first wave." Kestra didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. As the last surviving admiral of Earth's remnant fleet, emotion was a luxury that had died with the other colonies. How long until they reached the core districts? 18 minutes at current bombardment rate. 18 minutes. In 18 minutes, the Velter hegemony would complete what they'd started 7 years ago when they first darkened human space with their massive invasion fleets. Earth's other cities had fallen like dominoes: Moscow, Neo-Tokyo, Lagos Prime, the floating metropolis of Pacifica. Each bombardment followed the same cruel pattern: surgical strikes to cripple infrastructure, then systematic annihilation of population centers. The Velter didn't want prisoners or slaves. They wanted empty worlds. Status on the Lazarus Protocol? Kestra asked, though she dreaded the answer. Dr. Yenna Torst looked up from her console, her weathered face grim. "The quantum resonance chambers are at 96%. We need for more minutes to achieve full synchronization with the dimensional barriers." For minutes they didn't have. The Lazarus Protocol was humanity's most desperate project, a theoretical weapon that would tear holes in space-time itself. The science was barely understood, the consequences utterly unknown. But when extinction loomed, even theoretical weapons looked appealing. Outside, the bombardment intensified. The Velter ships descended lower, their massive hulks blotting out the dawn sky. Each vessel stretched nearly to kilometers in length, their biomechanical architecture writhing with organic weapon ports. The aliens themselves were worse bipedal nightmares, with crystalline carapaces and cluster eyes that reflected no mercy, no recognition of sentient life in other species. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the hegemony flagship," Communications Officer Rand Holask announced. "Put it through." The holographic projector flickered to life, revealing the insectoid horror of Velter High Commander Vorthon. Its mandibles clicked in what Kestra had learned was amusement. When it spoke, the universal translator rendered its chittering into cold, precise English. "Surface dwellers, your resistance ends now. Surrender your remaining population centers, and your death will be swift. Continue this futile struggle, and we will ensure your species suffers for cycles beyond counting." Kestra stepped forward, her reflection ghost-like in the transparent aluminum. "High Commander, I have a counter-proposal." The alien's compound eyes shifted, fracturing her image into 1,000 pieces. "You presumed a bargain from a position of defeat. I presume to warn you." Kestra's voice carried across the bunker with absolute authority. "You've conquered 4 to 7 worlds, exterminated 19 sentient species, and turned entire star systems into graveyards. But you've never fought humans at the edge of extinction." Vorthon's mandibles spread wider. "Your empty threats grow tiresome. Observe." The transmission cut, and immediately the bombardment doubled in intensity. The bunker shook as plasma fire struck the government district. Through the observation windows, Kestra watched the Parliament building, symbol of humanity's brief golden age. Among the stars melt into slag. 3 minutes to Lazarus activation. Dr. Torst called out. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Nex said quietly, "even if the protocol works, the casualties will be everybody dies anyway if we don't try." Kestra cut him off. She watched another district vanish in plasma fire. "At least this way, we take them with us." The bunker's lights flickered as another power relay overloaded. In the distance, she could see Velter dropships deploying atmospheric raiders. The ground assault phase would begin soon. They wanted to savor humanity's final moments, to watch the terror in human eyes as their last city burned. They had no idea what was coming. The first Velter raiders hit the outer residential sectors at 0352 hours, 5 minutes ahead of Kestra's most pessimistic projections. She watched through the bunker's tactical displays as hundreds of biomechanical drop pods crashed through burning skyscrapers like meteors of flesh and metal. Each pod split open with obscene, organic sounds, disgorging squads of Velter assault warriors. The aliens moved with predatory efficiency, their crystalline carapaces refracting the plasma fires into prismatic nightmares. Civilian evacuation status, Kestra demanded. 15% complete. Lieutenant next reported. The underground transit tunnels are packed beyond capacity. We're losing people to crushing and panic. On the tactical display, red icons representing Velter forces spread through the city like infection. Each icon represented a squad of 10 warriors, and there were already over 300 confirmed contacts. The mathematics of slaughter were brutally simple. New Geneva's remaining defensive forces numbered less than 50,000, most of them exhausted reservists and civilian volunteers. Admiral, we have contact, came the crackling voice of Major Thane Keller, commander of the 47th Urban Defense Battalion. His transmission cut through with the sound of weapons fire and screaming. They're hitting us from 3 directions. These bastards are faster than the intelligence report suggested. Through the Major's helmet camera, Kestra watched a squad of human defenders take positions behind the twisted wreckage of a metro station. The Velter warriors approached with horrifying grace, their movements flowing like liquid death. When they opened fire, their bioweapons discharged clusters of crystalline projectiles that burrowed through concrete as easily as flesh. Sergeant Mira Dench, barely 19 years old, screamed as a crystal shard tore through her abdomen. She kept firing anyway, her pulse rifle chattering until another shard took off her head in a spray of crimson. Fall back to secondary positions, Major Keller ordered, but it was too late. The Velter were already among them. Kestra watched one warrior grab Private George Kane by the throat, lifting the young man off his feet. The alien's mandibles spread wide, revealing rows of serrated biomechanical teeth. It bit down, and Kane's scream cut off in a wet gurgle. The warrior dropped the corpse and moved on, hunting for the next human to devour. 2 minutes to Lazarus. Activation, Dr. Torsk announced, her voice tight with concentration. The tactical display showed more red icons materializing throughout the city. The Velter weren't just conducting a ground assault. They were establishing forward positions for something larger. Kestra had seen this pattern before on the colony. Worlds. Bombardment, insertion, then systematic harvesting of any survivors for their biofactories. Admiral, the Eastern Defense Line is collapsing, Communications Officer Halask reported. The 23rd Battalion is requesting immediate reinforcement. Tell them to hold position. Kestra ordered, knowing it was a death sentence. All remaining forces are to maintain current positions. Until Lazarus activation, she couldn't tell them the truth that the Lazarus protocol would likely vaporize everything within a 50-kilometer radius. The quantum resonance chambers would tear holes in space-time itself, and the resulting dimensional cascade was theoretically powerful enough to destroy the Velter fleet. But the energy release would also turn New Geneva into a crater of twisted physics and broken reality. Another transmission crackled through from the surface. This is Captain Verakash, 12th Mechanized. We're being overrun at the industrial sector. They're not just killing, they're taking prisoners. I can see them dragging civilians into their ships. That was worse than death. The Velter biofactories use living sentience as raw material for their organic technology. A human could remain conscious for weeks while being slowly converted into ammunition, ship components, or worse. On the main display, she watched a group of Velter warriors surround a family shelter. The reinforced door held for 30 seconds before their bioacids ate through the metal. The screams that followed made Lieutenant Next turn away from his console. 90 seconds to activation, Dr. Torsk called out. The bunker shuddered as something massive impacted overhead. Dust rained from the ceiling, and several displays flickered. Through the observation windows, Kestra could see a Velter assault craft hovering directly above their position. Somehow, they located the command center. They know where we are, she said quietly. The first bioacid charges began eating through the bunker's roof armor. In minutes, maybe less, the Velter would breach their sanctuary. Around the command center, her staff continued working with desperate efficiency, each knowing they were probably in their final moments. 60 seconds to activation, Dr. Torsk announced. The roof armor gave way with a sound like screaming metal. Velter warriors dropped through the hole, their compound eyes gleaming with hunger. They moved with terrifying purpose, ignoring the desperate gunfire from the bunker's security detail. Lieutenant Next drew his sidearm and put to round center mass into the nearest warrior. The bullet shattered against its carapace, like rain against a windchill. The alien backhanded him across the bunker, and his neck snapped with an audible crack. 30 seconds, Dr. Torsk whispered, her fingers dancing across the activation controls. The Velter warrior that killed Lieutenant Nex turned its compound eyes toward Admiral Kestra Vaughn, mandibles clicking with predatory satisfaction. She didn't run. Instead, she stood perfectly still as the alien approached, her hand resting on the emergency activation switch for the Lazarus protocol. Around the bunker, her remaining staff fought desperately against the dozen warriors who had breached their defenses. Communications Officer Halask managed to put a plasma charge into one attacker's thorax before two others tore him apart with their claws. 20 seconds, Dr. Torsk called out, even as a bioacid projectile seared past her head, leaving a smoking hole in the quantum resonance console. The warrior facing Kestra extended one crystalline talon, touching it gently to her throat. When it spoke, its voice bypassed the universal translator, entirely a direct neural intrusion that made her skull feel like it was splitting apart. You die last, surface dweller first. You watch your species harvested dot through the bunker's compromised tactical displays. Kestra could see the true scope of the Velter operation unfolding. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a processing operation. Massive biofactory ships were descending through the atmosphere, their organic hulls pulsing with digestive chambers and conversion matrices. The handful of surviving civilian populations would be loaded into those ships while still alive, then slowly transformed into components for the hegemony's war machine. 10 seconds, Dr. Torsk gasped, blood streaming from her nose where the neural intrusion had caught her as well. The warrior's talon pressed deeper, drawing a thin line of blood from Kestra's throat. She could feel its hunger, its anticipation of the slow consumption that would follow. But she could also feel something else, a vibration in the air, a harmonic resonance building in the quantum chambers 3 levels below. 5 seconds, above ground, the slaughter continued. Through her dying tactical network, she watched the last pockets of human resistance being systematically eliminated. Major Keller's battalion had been reduced to scattered individuals hiding in the ruins. Captain Kosh's mechanized unit was gone, their vehicles dissolved by bioacids, their crews being loaded into processing pods. 3 seconds, the Velter warrior began to apply pressure, preparing to decapitate her slowly. Its compound eyes reflected her face in 1,000 fragments, each showing a different angle of human defeat. 2 seconds, Kestra smiled, and the warrior hesitated, confused by this expression of joy in the face of extinction. 1 second, she reached up and grabbed the alien's talon, letting it slice through her palm as she spoke her final words. You should have glassed us from orbit. Dr. Torsk's finger found the activation switch. The Lazarus protocol engaged. Reality screamed. The quantum resonance chambers, buried deep beneath New Geneva, had been designed to destabilize the fundamental barriers between dimensions. For the past 7 years, humanity's greatest scientific minds had worked in absolute secrecy to create a weapon that could theoretically destroy matter at the subatomic level. They had succeeded beyond their wildest nightmares. The dimensional cascade began as a whisper, a slight distortion in the air that made the eye water, and the mind recoil. Then the whisper became a shriek, and the shriek became something beyond sound, beyond sensation, beyond the ability of any living thing to comprehend. Space-time fractured like glass struck by a hammer. The effect radiated outward from the bunker at nearly the speed of light, but its passage was visible as reality itself convulsed. The first wave caught the Velter warriors inside the command center, and they simply unraveled, not disintegrated, not vaporized, unraveled, as if the fundamental forces holding their atoms together had forgotten how to function. The warrior holding Kestra released its grip, staring in horror at its own talon as it began to dissolve into probability clouds. Its scream was cut short, as its vocal cords ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Dr. Torsk had just enough time to see her life's work succeed before the cascade reached her console. She smiled as her fingers turned to quantum foam, then her hands, then her arms. Her last thought was a mixture of triumph and terror. They had done it, but God helped them. They had actually done it. The cascade burst through the bunker's walls, like a wave of impossibility, racing upward toward the surface. It caught the Velter biofactory ships as they hovered above the city, and the alien screams were audible, even through the vacuum of space. Their organic hulls, evolved over millions of years to process living matter, tried desperately to adapt to the cascade's effects. They failed spectacularly. The first biofactory ship began eating itself, its digestive chambers turning inside out as the dimensional distortions confused the distinction between internal and external space. The second ship simply folded in half along an axis that didn't exist in normal spacetime, its crew experiencing the unique horror of being compressed into two-dimensional awareness while remaining fully conscious. On the surface, the remaining human defenders watched in awe and terror as their final city began to dissolve around them. Buildings didn't collapse, they faded like morning mist. Streets didn't crack, they forgot they had ever been solid. The barriers shimmered with probability cascades that made breathing an act of will. Major Keller, crouched in the ruins of a shopping complex, watched a Velter warrior charge toward him. Halfway through its attack, the alien's left side phased into a parallel dimension while its right side remained anchored in baseline reality. The resulting spatial contradiction tore it apart across 17 different planes of existence. "What the hell do we do?" he whispered into his comm unit, not expecting an answer from the dead. But the sky answered him instead. The dimensional cascade had reached the upper atmosphere, and the barriers between realities were breaking down completely. Through the cracks in spacetime, something else was coming through, something that had been waiting on the other side of everything. Watching humanity struggle with ancient, patient eyes, the sky cracked open and it screamed. The things that came through the cracks in reality defied every law of physics humanity had ever discovered and violated several they hadn't. Major Thane Keller pressed himself against the dissolved remains of what had once been a concrete wall, watching in paralyzed terror as entities from beyond baseline spacetime poured through. The dimensional rifts, they weren't the geometric impossibilities he'd expected from parallel dimensions. They were far worse. They were familiar. They were human. "Control, are you seeing this?" he whispered into his comm unit, knowing the command bunker was nothing but quantum foam now. The things coming through, they looked like us, but they weren't quite human. These beings moved with predatory grace that reminded Keller of the Velter, but their motions carried a fluid lethality that made the aliens look clumsy by comparison. Their skin held a metallic sheen that shifted colors with each movement, and their eyes burned with the cold fire of stars being born. One of them turned toward Keller's hiding spot, and when it smiled, he saw rows of teeth that looked suspiciously like crystalline Velter bioweapons. It spoke in perfect, unaccented English. "Hello, little brother. We've been waiting such a long time to come home." Across the dying city, similar encounters were unfolding with horrifying consistency. Captain Verakash, leading the last survivors of her mechanized unit through the reality-warped streets, found herself face to face with a being that wore her dead husband's face. It moved with impossible speed, covering 30 meters in a single bound, landing directly in front of her with barely a sound. "Vera," it said, using Marcus's voice with perfect inflection. "Don't you recognize me?" She put 3 plasma rounds, sent her mass without hesitation. The bolts passed through the entity as if it were made of light and shadow, then emerged from behind to strike a nearby building. The structure didn't explode, it inverted, turning itself inside out like a geometric puzzle solving itself in reverse. "That wasn't very friendly," the Marcus thing said, its features beginning to shift and flow. "We came all this way to help you fight the bugs around the city." The Velter forces were discovering that their technological superiority meant nothing against enemies who could ignore the fundamental laws of reality. A squad of warriors attempting to process survivors in the university district found themselves surrounded by beings that looked like the humans they'd been torturing moments before. High Commander Vorthon, coordinating the battle from his flagship in low orbit, watched his tactical displays dissolve into chaos. His assault forces were reporting impossible encounters, humans who could phase through solid matter, humans who could multiply themselves across space, humans who spoke with the voices of his own dead clutchmates. "Status report," he demanded. Through the bioneural command link, "Ground forces are compromised," came the reply from War Leader Thekmer. "The surface dwellers have somehow become like us, but worse. They are hunting my warriors for sport." Through the flagship's observation ports, Vorthon could see the dimensional rifts spreading across Earth's atmosphere like infected wounds. Each crack leaked more than not quite humans into baseline reality, and they were displaying capabilities that made his species' biotechnology look primitive by comparison. One of the entities, this one wearing the face of a human child, but moving with the liquid grace of a master assassin, had somehow managed to reach the exterior hull of his flagship. It clung to the biometal surface with hands that ended in what looked like miniature black holes, each fingertip drawing matter from the ship itself. The child thing looked directly at Vorthon through the transparent aluminum, tilted its head with curious innocence, and began to sing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, and completely impossible sound couldn't travel through vacuum. Yet somehow, the song reached his auditory clusters and made his carapace vibrate in harmonic resonance. The whole began to dissolve where the child thing touched it. Emergency withdrawal, Vorthon commanded, but his bioneural links were already failing. The song was somehow interfacing directly with his organic ship systems, convincing them that solid matter was merely a temporary inconvenience. On the surface, Major Keller was learning that the entities from beyond space-time had very specific ideas about warfare. The one that had been speaking to him, the one that looked almost human, except for the teeth and the eyes and the way it moved like liquid mercury, had just demonstrated its tactical philosophy by completely dismantling a Velter patrol. You see, it explained conversationally while the Velter warriors tried desperately to retreat. Your species has this charming notion that war should have rules, objectives, some kind of logical framework. It gestured, and one of the fleeing aliens simply stopped existing, not killed, not vaporized, erased from the timeline as if it had never been born. But we've learned better. The entity continued. We've learned that the only rule of war is that there are no rules. The only objective is victory, and the only logical framework is whatever works. Another gesture, and the remaining Velter began to age rapidly, their carapaces cracking as centuries of entropy compressed into seconds. They screamed with voices that became increasingly high-pitched as their vocal cords shrank, until only silence remained. Where did you come from? Keller managed to ask. The entity's smile widened, showing more teeth than any mouth should have been able to hold. We came from where you're all going, eventually. The place humanity reaches when it stops pretending to be civilized. It gestured toward the dimensional rifts. You open the door between what is and what could be, where what could be, if you let us. Above them, the Velter biofactory ships were learning that their organic nature made them particularly vulnerable to entities that existed partially outside of normal space-time. The not-quite-humans were phasing directly through their hulls, appearing inside command centers and processing chambers with the casual ease of walking through an open door. The screams echoing across the dying city were no longer just human or Velter, they were something entirely new. The sound of reality itself learning to fear what humanity could become. When pushed beyond all limits, the war between three species reached its crescendo at 08 for 7 hours, when High Commander Vorthon made the catastrophic decision to deploy his flagship's planet-killer weapon against the dimensional entities. The bio-cannon charged with a sound like a whale song played through broken glass, its organic components drawing power from the life force of 10,000 Velter crew members. The weapon had cracked planets, boiled oceans, and reduced entire star systems to cosmic dust. Against enemies that existed partially outside of reality itself, it proved to be exactly the wrong choice. The energy beam struck the largest dimensional rift directly above New Geneva, and instead of closing it, the massive discharge fed back. Through the tear in space-time like fuel poured on a fire, the rift expanded exponentially, and the things that poured through were no longer wearing human faces. Major Keller watched from his position in the ruins as beings of pure predatory instinct materialized across the battlefield. These weren't the almost human entities from before. These were humanity's potential. Carried to its absolute extreme, they moved like wolves made of shadow and starlight, their forms shifting between physical matter and something beyond comprehension. Jesus Christ, Captain Kosh whispered through the comm channel. What are those things? One of the shadow wolves turned toward her voice, and she got her answer. For just a moment, its features solidified into something recognizable, her own face. But stripped of every trace of mercy, compassion, or restraint, it spoke with her voice. But the words came from a throat that had forgotten how to scream. Anything but victory. We are what you become when the last innocent dies, it said. We are humanity's final form. The battle that followed defied every conventional understanding of warfare. The Velter, despite their technological superiority and numerical advantage, found themselves caught between two impossible enemies. The dimensional entities attacked with weapons that existed in 17 different realities simultaneously. while the surviving human defenders fought with the desperate fury of a species with nothing left to lose. Sergeant Willem Korsch, one of the few members of the 23rd Battalion still alive, found himself fighting alongside a shadow wolf against a squad of Velter biotroopers. The creature moved with liquid grace, its claws phasing through the alien's carapaces to tear at organs that existed in dimensions the Velter couldn't even perceive. "Behind you," Korsch shouted. As a Velter warrior flanked the shadow wolf with acid spitters charging, the entity didn't turn around. Instead, it simply existed behind the warrior for a moment, long enough to tear out its primary neural cluster with teeth that looked suspiciously like miniaturized plasma cannons. When the Velter fell, the shadow wolf was already back in its original position, as if it had never moved at all. Cooperative hunting, it explained to Korsch with something that might have been approval. Your species' greatest strength, refined across infinite possibilities. Above the battlefield, the Velter fleet was experiencing losses that violated their understanding of physics. 3 more biofactory ships had been boarded by entities that phased through their hulls like they were made of mist. The screams echoing through the fleet's bioneural networks weren't just from the crews being slaughtered, they were from the ships themselves, as the dimensional beings convinced the organic vessels that solid matter was a bureaucratic error that needed to be corrected. High Commander Vorthon watched his tactical displays dissolve into chaos, as another cruiser simply folded itself into origami, its crew experiencing the unique horror of existing in geometric forms that had no names in any language. His own flagship was under assault by things that looked like human children, but moved with the hunting instincts of apex predators. "All units, concentrate fire on the dimensional rifts," he commanded through the failing bioneural links. "Collapse the tiers in space-time." It was exactly the wrong order to give. The concentrated fire from 60 Velter warships struck the largest rift simultaneously, and the feedback effect was immediate and catastrophic. Instead of closing, the dimensional tier inverted itself, becoming a portal that existed in all possible realities at once. Through it came things that made the shadow wolves look tame by comparison. They came through as geometric impossibilities that hurt to look at directly, but as they entered baseline reality, they took on forms that were somehow worse than their incomprehensible true shapes. They wore the faces of every human who had ever died in the war, but their expressions carried the accumulated fury of 7 years of systematic genocide. Major Keller recognized his dead wife Sarah among them, but when she looked at him, her eyes held the cold fire of supernovas being born. She moved through a squad of Velter warriors like a force of nature, each gesture sending aliens tumbling through dimensional spaces that folded back on themselves in recursive loops of agony. "We tried to warn them," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that existed in frequencies beyond human hearing. "We tried to show them what mercy looked like. They chose this instead." The battle reached its peak intensity as all 3 forces converged in the ruins of New Geneva's central district. Velter biotroopers fired weapons that dissolved matter at the molecular level, while dimensional entities responded with attacks that existed in past, present, and future simultaneously. The surviving human defenders found themselves fighting with equipment that had been transformed by exposure to impossible physics pulse rifles that fired bullets backwards through time, armor that existed in 17 dimensions at once. Captain Kosh watched one of her soldiers, Private Jensen Mora, put a round through a Velter warrior's head. The bullet emerged from the alien's skull 3 seconds before she pulled the trigger, giving the creature just enough time to experience the unique terror of watching its own death approach with mathematical inevitability. The casualties were mounting on all sides, but the nature of the losses defied conventional counting. Velter warriors weren't just dying, they were being edited out of existence, their bioships convinced that they had never been constructed in the first place. Human defenders found themselves existing in multiple realities simultaneously, some dying in one dimension while achieving victory in another. And the dimensional entities, they weren't taking casualties so much as they were evolving, each apparent death spawning 3 more predators with increasingly refined hunting strategies. The city itself had become a weapon, its geography warped by reality storms that turned streets into Möbius strips and buildings into climb bottles. The very air was dangerous to breathe, filled with probability cascades that could turn a single inhalation into a quantum superposition of every possible future. By 0930 hours, it was clear that conventional warfare had become meaningless. This was no longer a battle for territory or resources, it was a fundamental conflict over which version of reality would be allowed to continue existing. At 11:27 hours. As New Geneva burned in 17 different dimensions simultaneously, Admiral Kestra Vaughn opened her eyes and discovered she was still alive. This was problematic, since she distinctly remembered being at Ground Zero when the Lazarus Protocol activated. She should have been unraveled into component particles, dispersed across multiple realities, or at minimum reduced to quantum foam. Instead, she was lying on what appeared to be the floor of her command bunker, which was also problematic since the bunker had been dissolved by a dimensional cascade. "Over an hour ago. You're awake," said a voice that sounded exactly like her own. "Good, we need to talk." Kestra sat up slowly, her head spinning with the after effects of existing in 11 dimensions simultaneously. Standing across from her was herself, or rather, a version of herself that had never learned to compromise, never learned to doubt, never learned to feel guilt over necessary sacrifices. This other Kestra wore the same uniform, but it fit differently, as if tailored for someone who had never questioned whether the ends justified the means. "You're one of them," Kestra said. "The things from beyond space-time. We're all you." The other Kestra replied, "Every possible version of humanity that could have existed. If you'd made different choices, I'm the version of you that never hesitated when the Velter first appeared. The version that deployed the dimensional weapons immediately, without worrying about civilian casualties or moral implications around them. The command bunker existed in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously destroyed and intact, occupied and empty, past and present. Through the flickering walls, Kestra could see the battle raging across multiple realities. The Velter fleet was being systematically dismantled by entities that fought with humanity's tactical brilliance, but without any of its restraint. The Lazarus Protocol wasn't just a weapon, the other Kestra explained. It was a summoning. Every time your species faced extinction, every choice you made that led to this moment, it created resonance patterns across the dimensional barriers. You called us here by proving that humanity could be pushed beyond all moral boundaries." Kestra watched through the ghostly walls as a shadow wolf wearing her dead brother's face tore through a Velter biotrooper with claws made of crystallized time. The alien screams echoed across multiple dimensions as it died in past, present, and future simultaneously. "We didn't ask for this," she said. Double quotes, "Yes, you did." The other Kestra gestured toward the battle. "Every time you chose to sacrifice civilians to save military assets, every time you authorized weapons testing on captured aliens, every time you decided that survival justified any action, no matter how monstrous you were calling us, on the tactical displays that existed in 17 different states of functionality." Kestra could see the true scope of what was happening. The dimensional entities weren't just fighting the Velter, they were winning. High Commander Vorthon's flagship had been boarded by things that looked like human children, but moved with the hunting instincts of cosmic predators. The bioneural networks that controlled the Velter fleet were being systematically convinced that existence was a clerical error that needed correction. The question, the other Kestra continued, is what happens next? We can finish this war. For you, we can eliminate the Velter threat completely, tear their empire apart across infinite realities, make them suffer in ways that their biology can't even comprehend. All we ask in return is that you let us stay, and if we refuse, the other Kestra smiled. And for a moment her teeth looked exactly like crystalline Velter bioweapons. "Then you go back to fighting a war you can't win, against enemies who outnumber you 1,000 to 1, with weapons that can barely scratch their hulls. How long do you think humanity will last?" Through the quantum-shifted windows, Kestra could see Major Keller leading a desperate charge against a Velter processing center. The Shadow Wolves fought alongside his remaining soldiers. They're impossible, weapons tearing through alien defenses like paper. But she could also see the cost with each victory. The human defenders became a little less human, their movements a little more predatory, their eyes a little colder. "They're changing," she observed. "Evolution," the other Kestra corrected. "This is what your species becomes when survival is the only law that matters. We're not invaders, Admiral. We're your future." A new alarm began sounding, not through the bunker's destroyed speakers, but directly through the quantum foam that had replaced the command center's electronic systems. Captain Kosh's voice crackled through dimensional static. "Any surviving command personnel? We've got a problem. The entities they're not just fighting the Velter anymore. They're hunting civilians. Anyone who won't fight, anyone who shows mercy, they're treating them like prey." Kestra felt something cold settle in her stomach. You're killing our own people. We're removing weakness from the gene pool, the other Kestra replied, without a trace of emotion. The Velter were just the beginning. There are worse things out there in the galaxy species that make the hegemony look like pacifists. Humanity needs to be strong enough to face them through the tactical displays. Kestra watched a group of civilian survivors trying to surrender to a Velter patrol. The aliens were actually considering accepting the surrender their bioneural programming didn't account for humans who refused to fight, but before the Velter could respond, shadow wolves materialized around the civilians and began to feed. The screams that followed weren't human or alien, they were the sound of innocence, itself being devoured by necessity. This isn't survival, Kestra said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. This is extinction with extra steps. The other Kestra's expression shifted, confusion flickering across features that had forgotten how to doubt. You would choose weakness over victory. I would choose humanity over whatever you've become. Kestra stood, and for the first time since the dimensional cascade began, she felt completely clear about what needed to be done. You're right about one thing, we called you here, but we can send you back. Impossible. The barriers between dimensions are compromised, not destroyed. Kestra moved toward the quantum-shifted control panels, her fingers dancing across interfaces that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. The Lazarus Protocol created resonance patterns that open the rifts. The same patterns can close them if someone is willing to pay the price. The other Kestra's eyes widened with something that might have been fear. You'll doom your species. Without us, you can't defeat the Velter. Without us, humanity dies. Maybe, Kestra admitted, beginning the shutdown sequence for the quantum resonance chambers. But we'll die as humans, not as monsters wearing human faces. Outside the bunker, the battle was reaching its climax. Major Keller and his surviving soldiers had established a perimeter around the last group of civilian survivors, barely 300 people. Out of New Geneva's original population of 8 million, the shadow wolves circled them like predators, their forms shifting between human faces and geometric impossibilities. Choose, one of them said, wearing the face of Keller's dead daughter. Fight with us or feed us. There are no other options. Keller raised his pulse rifle, not at the Velter, but at the entity wearing his child's face. Yeah, there are. We can choose to be better than our worst impulses, even if it kills us. The shadow wolf tilted its head with predatory curiosity. Even if it kills everyone, especially. Then, high above, High Commander Vorthon felt the tide of battle shifting in ways his strategic programming couldn't comprehend. The dimensional entities that had been systematically dismantling his fleet were suddenly hesitating. Their attacks became less coordinated, their movements less fluid. It was as if something was calling them back across the barriers between realities. Through his flagship's bioneural sensors, he detected massive energy fluctuations emanating from the surface. Not the chaotic resonance of dimensional rifts, but something far more controlled. The humans were attempting to close the tiers in space-time. Even though it would leave them defenseless against his remaining forces, it was tactically insane. It was strategically suicidal. It was exactly the kind of irrational decision that had made humanity such a dangerous enemy. All units, he commanded through the failing bioneural links, prepare for final assault. The surface dwellers are recalling their dimensional allies. We finish this now. But even as he gave the order, Vorthon felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of conquest. Respect for his enemies. They were choosing certain death over moral compromise. And there was something terrifyingly human about that decision. In a quantum-shifted bunker, Kestra felt the dimensional barriers beginning to respond to the shutdown sequence. The shadow wolves and geometric impossibilities were being pulled back through the rifts, their forms becoming increasingly translucent as the resonance patterns collapsed. You're making a mistake, the other Kestra said, her voice growing fainter, as she was drawn back toward whatever reality had spawned her. The galaxy is full of monsters. You need to become monsters to survive. Maybe, Kestra replied, her fingers steady on the controls despite the knowledge of what was coming. But I'd rather die fighting monsters than become one. The other Kestra smiled sadly as she began to fade. We'll be waiting, Admiral, when the next extinction event comes. When humanity faces something worse than the Velter, we'll be waiting for you to call us back. Then you'll be waiting a long time. The dimensional rifts began to collapse with a sound like reality itself sighing in relief. The shadow wolves, the geometric impossibilities, The things that wore human faces but thought within human logic. All of them were being drawn back across the barriers between what was and what could be. Major Keller watched the entity wearing his daughter's face dissolve into probability clouds. Its last words carried on dimensional winds. "Remember us, Daddy. Remember what you could become." Then they were gone, and humanity stood alone against the Velter fleet with nothing but conventional weapons, desperate courage, and the absolute certainty that they would choose extinction over transformation into something monstrous. The final phase of the battle was about to begin. At 12:03 hours. With the dimensional rift sealed and humanity's monstrous potential locked away behind barriers of controlled quantum foam, Admiral Kestra Von made a discovery that would redefine the entire war. The Velter weren't attacking anymore. High Commander, Vorthon's flagship hung motionless in the atmosphere above New Geneva's ruins, its bioweapons powered down, its assault craft returning to their docking bays. Across the dying city, Velter ground forces had ceased their advance and were actually withdrawing from forward positions. "Ma'am," came Major Keller's voice through the quantum static comm system. They're pulling back. All of them. What the hell is going on?" Kestra studied the tactical displays, trying to make sense of enemy behavior that violated every pattern they'd observed over 7 years of warfare. The Velter had humanity exactly where they wanted them, defenseless, outnumbered, reduced to a few hundred survivors with conventional weapons. This should have been the moment for total extermination. Instead, the aliens were retreating. "Open a channel to the hegemony flagship," she ordered. "Admiral, communications are, just do it." The holographic projector flickered to life, revealing High Commander Vorthon's insectoid features. But something had changed in the aliens' compound eyes. Where before there had been predatory hunger and cold calculation, now there was something that looked almost like respect. "Surface dweller," Vorthon said, his mandibles clicking in what Kestra had learned was contemplation rather than amusement. "You have surprised us." "How so?" "In 4 to 7 years of conquest, we have encountered 19 sentient species. All of them chose survival over principle when faced with extinction. All of them accepted transformation into our biofactories rather than face oblivion. You are the first to choose differently through the bunker's quantum-shifted windows." Kestra could see Velter transports ascending through the atmosphere, loaded with the biotechnology that had been processing human survivors. The aliens were actually returning their prisoners. "We have reevaluated your species," Vorthon continued. "The hegemony requires worlds for expansion, but we have discovered that we require something else as well. Worthy enemies. Adversaries who challenge our assumptions about survival and adaptation. You're sparing us because we impressed you?" Kestra couldn't keep the incredulity out of her voice. "We are sparing you because you have proven that strength is not merely the absence of weakness. Your species chose certain death over moral compromise. This is a form of power we had not previously encountered." Major Keller's voice crackled through the comm system. "Admiral, I'm seeing something incredible down here. They're leaving supplies, medical equipment, food synthesizers, construction materials. It's like they're trying to help us rebuild." Vorthon's mandibles spread in what might have been approval. "The hegemony will withdraw from this system. Your world will be designated as protected territory. But understand, surface dwellers, this protection comes with expectations." "What kind of expectations?" "The galaxy contains threats far worse than the Velter hegemony, species that would make our biofactories seem merciful by comparison. When those threats emerge, when the cosmos itself faces extinction, we may have need of allies who possess your particular form of strength." Kestra felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You want us as weapons. We want you as yourselves," Vorthon corrected, "unchanged, uncompromised. The universe has enough monsters, Admiral. What it lacks is heroes." The transmission ended, and Kestra found herself alone in the quantum-shifted bunker, staring at tactical displays that showed the Velter fleet departing Earth's orbit with deliberate, almost ceremonial precision. After 7 years of systematic genocide, humanity's greatest enemy was simply leaving. "Ma'am?" Major Keller's voice carried through the static. "What are your orders?" Kestra looked out at the ruins of New Geneva, where barely 1,000 humans had survived out of 8 million. The city was gone. The orbital defenses were scrap metal, and humanity's presence in the galaxy had been reduced to a single scarred world and a handful of survivors. But they were still human, still capable of choosing principle over survival, morality over expedience. still capable of looking into the abyss and refusing to become what they saw there. Begin search and rescue operations, she ordered. Every survivor, every injured civilian, every soldier who's still breathing, we bring them home, that we rebuild. Rebuild what? Admiral, the city's gone. The infrastructure's gone. We've got maybe 1,000 people and whatever supplies the Velter left behind. Kestra smiled, and for the first time in 7 years. It was a smile of genuine hope rather than desperate defiance. We rebuild humanity, Major. The real thing, not some nightmare version that prioritizes survival over souls. Over the following weeks, as the survivors of New Geneva began the impossible task of reconstruction, reports filtered in from across the galaxy. The Velter hegemony had declared a moratorium on expansion, their biofleets withdrawing from dozens of contested systems, other species those that had survived the hegemony's previous conquests through submission, and transformation began to emerge from their hiding places. Word spread through the galactic community. Humanity had faced extinction and chosen honor. Instead, they had summoned monsters from beyond space-time and then banished them rather than accept the power they offered. They had proven that strength without principle was merely another form of weakness. Dr. Yenatorsk, who had somehow survived the quantum cascade through a probability loop that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, established new research protocols for dimensional physics. Her first official act was to classify all research related to transdimensional weaponry, ensuring that humanity would never again be tempted to call forth its own potential monsters. Major Keller, promoted to general in recognition of his leadership during the final battle, established the New Geneva Protocol's military guidelines that prioritize the protection of civilian life and the preservation of human values even in the face of certain defeat. The protocols became required study for every officer in the reformed Earth Defense Force. Captain Kosh founded the Remembrance Archive, a comprehensive record of everyone who had died during the Velter War. Every name, every story, every sacrifice would be preserved, so that future generations would understand the true cost of survival and the greater cost of abandoning one's principles. And Admiral Kestra Vaughn, promoted to Fleet Admiral and overall commander of humanity's renewed space forces, established a simple guiding principle for all future military operations. We fight to protect what makes us human, not to ensure that something calling itself human survives. The scars on Earth's surface would take decades to heal. The orbital infrastructure would require years to rebuild. The human population, reduced to barely 50 million across all remaining colonies, would need generations to recover, but humanity had passed its greatest test. When faced with the choice between survival and soul, they had chosen to remain themselves. When offered the power to become cosmic predators, they had refused. When the sky cracked open and screamed, they had listened to the screaming and decided that some prices were too high to pay. The galaxy was watching now, and what it saw was a species that would rather face extinction than lose its humanity. In a cosmos full of monsters, that made them the most dangerous creatures of all, not because of what they were willing to become, but because of what they refused to become. The Velter had been right about one thing. The universe needed heroes. Humanity had chosen to be exactly that. In the ruins of New Geneva, as the first new buildings rose from foundations of quantum-scarred Earth, children played games that their parents had forgotten how to play during the war years. They laughed without looking over their shoulders for enemy ships. They built toys instead of weapons. They dreamed of growing up in a universe where monsters could be faced without becoming monsters in return. The sky above them was blue and clean, unmarked by dimensional rifts or reality storms. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, the older children claimed they could still hear echoes of that terrible screaming, the sound of humanity's potential calling from beyond the barriers between realities. But the barriers held, reinforced by quantum locks and dimensional shields, protected by the absolute determination of a species that had looked into its own dark mirror and chosen to remain in the light. The monsters were still out there, waiting in the spaces between realities for humanity's next moment of desperate weakness. They would wait forever.